Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. With the deadline for the withdrawal of NATO forces from Afghanistan drawing ever closer, and with an increased determination on the part of a number of Western leaders to get their troops home as quickly as possible, we ask today what future there will be for Afghanistan. Indeed, what difference more than a decade of war will have made by the time those forces leave. And to do that, I'm joined today by Ambassador James Dobbin, who's the Director of the International Security and Defence Policy Centre at the RAND National Defence Research Centre. Thanks very much for being with us today. You were in the wake of 9/11 in 2001, Ambassador Dobbins, named by President Bush as the envoy, the US envoy to Afghanistan, with a specific task of speaking to the Afghan opposition with a view to building a broad-based opposition that would stand against the Taliban. Looking back now and with all that's happened, did that not seem something of an impossible task?
Well, in the short term, it actually proved somewhat easier than anticipated. We were able to bring all factions of the opposition together with the help of the United Nations in Bonn in November of 2001, only a few weeks after 9/11. After about 10 days of work, they produced an agreement on an interim government headed by Hamid Karzai. That government took office in mid-December. And it was subsequently reaffirmed in a Loya Jirga, that is a Grand Council, and then through elections. I do think that we missed an opportunity, not in 2001, but in 2002, to try to reconcile many of the Taliban leadership who probably at that point would have been prepared to come over and join the new constitutional order.
I suppose that the assumption was that was made was that given that they had been routed fairly quickly, indeed within a matter of weeks, given that those initial signals that you mentioned went so smoothly, the assumption was that the Taliban could be defeated. I suppose it was far from anyone's imagination back in those early days that they would come out as strong as they have more than a decade later.
I think most of us thought they had been so discredited by reason of their behavior in office and then the swiftness with which they were overthrown, that they were unlikely to make a comeback. They had been defeated. They had been ejected from the country. I think we didn't anticipate, first of all, that Pakistan would renew its support for them and allow them to organize and again project an insurgency into Afghanistan. And I think there was also a failure to recognize the need to deploy a larger peacekeeping force in Afghanistan during a period when there was no insurgency, but was a great deal of disorder and uncertainty. And I think had we done that, reconstruction would have begun more quickly. The government in Kabul would have gained credibility with the population. And it's quite possible that the insurgency never would have reached the level that it has.
Pakistan growing ever more unstable. Its relations with the United States have deteriorated over the last few months. What hope can there be for Afghanistan with foreign troops now set to leave?
Well, I think the U.S. government and the alliance governments are pursuing a two-track policy. One is to make an effort to negotiate a peace settlement. And the second is to continue to support the emergence of an Afghan government and Afghan security forces that can continue to deny the insurgency its objective, which is to take over the country. The objective, thus, is not to defeat the insurgency, as you suggest. That can't be done as long as they enjoy a sanctuary in Pakistan. But the insurgency wants to take over the country, and I think it's quite likely that the non-Taliban elements in Afghanistan will indefinitely deny them that objective.
Do you think they have the capacity to? Given the porous nature of the border, given the popularity of the Taliban within many parts of Afghanistan, given its support from across the border, is there any hope that Afghan forces will really have what it takes to keep them at bay?
Well, I don't think it's right to attribute popularity to the Taliban. They never poll more than about 10%. in terms of support, and at most 20% in terms of acquiescence. Whereas the government, despite all its faults, despite perceptions of corruption and inefficiency, continues to poll far better among the population than the American government in the United States or the French government in France. More than half the population are not Pashtuns. The Taliban is an almost exclusively Pashtun insurgency, and it only represents a minority of the Pashtuns. It is the best organized minority in the country, and that's one of the reasons why we're pursuing the negotiated strategy, because we don't believe that they can be exterminated or completely marginalized. And indeed, the Afghans don't regard the Taliban as a foreign body or a group of extremists that ought to be ignored. Most Afghans think they ought to be part of a larger process.
They have, of course, benefited from being able to step in to the gaps that a failed state has left throughout the country. It's going to be very difficult to counter that. What hope do you have for a negotiated strategy? What can it actually bring, in your view?
Well, I think there are several reasons to pursue negotiations. One is because there's overwhelming support for the process among the Afghan population. There are elements of the population that are apprehensive about a negotiation, but even most Tajiks, most Uzbeks, and most women support a negotiated process. And naturally, they'll pursue their own interest within that negotiation. So one reason to pursue it is because it's strongly supported by the Afghan population, and a failure to pursue it would be condemned by that population. Secondly, as I've suggested, the Taliban, while they recognize that they can't be eliminated, may also recognize that they are never going to be able to take over the whole country, that the returning to the situation pre-2001 simply isn't an option for them.
The trouble for as far as the negotiated strategy goes, is that crucial to any negotiation with the Taliban is Pakistan's involvement. We've established that they are more than key players in all of this. Won't the deterioration of the relationship between Washington and Islamabad be an obstacle to a negotiated solution, indeed to fruitful discussions at all?
Yes. On the other hand, what I think it's notable that the dialogue between Washington and Pakistan on the negotiations track is probably the one element of the relationship that has suffered least from the recent shocks of bin Laden's death and then of the attack on the Pakistani border post. Pakistan has not objected to the decision and agreement to open a Taliban office in Doha, and they've allowed they've allowed the Afghan Taliban representatives to travel from Pakistan there in order to open that office. So for the moment, at least, Pakistan is not obstructing the peace process, although you're quite right to indicate that if they were to do so, that would make it a lot more difficult.
I suppose then one of the big threats over all this is the instability facing the Pakistani government, which for the time being is playing ball, but is itself under threat because of internal turmoil.
One of the problems with a negotiation is the lack of coherence among most of the parties that have to take part in it. By that I mean the degree to which they're internally divided. This is almost certainly true of the Taliban. There are almost certainly elements of the Taliban that would oppose a negotiation. The assassination of former President Rabbani, who was the leading Karzai government representative in such a negotiation, by elements of the Taliban is an indication that there are those who oppose the process. There are certainly those in Karzai's government who are opposed to the process. And as you suggest, the Pakistani government is also divided. So one of the big obstacles in this negotiation is not getting the parties to agree with each other. It's getting the parties to agree internally on what their objectives are, and then pursuing it through a process of diplomacy.
This process of diplomacy, which hangs by a number of threads in a number of different respects, does it surprise you that after a decade of war we should be here and no further, and that it should be negotiation with the Taliban that should be the key to this ending vaguely in peace and in some sort of stability for the region? Do you regard the war in Afghanistan as a failure?
I believe that there were a number of mistakes. I don't believe it was wrong to have invaded Afghanistan and overthrown the Taliban in the aftermath of 9/11. I do believe that the Bush administration, in the hubris of the moment, made a number of serious mistakes for which we're still paying. One was to refuse to allow international peacekeepers to be deployed throughout the country. A second one was to invade Iraq a year later, diverting resources and attention. A third was to initially provide very limited economic assistance to Afghanistan, 16 times less than what was provided to Bosnia, for instance, on a per capita basis. And finally, as I've suggested, a failure to try to co-opt those elements of the Taliban that were prepared to come over. A number of them surrendered and were prepared to cooperate within the new political system, and instead we brought them to Guantanamo or to prison in Bagram and kept them there for years.
Ambassador James Dobbins, thanks very much indeed for having joined us today. That brings us to the end of today's interview. We'll be back though very soon for another here on France 24. I do hope you'll stay with us. Goodbye.